Welcome to day 185 on the trail. We have four readings for today from 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 1 through 4:16, 1 Samuel 27 verse 1 through 28:25, Ruth chapter 4 verses 1 through 22, and 2 Maccabees 12 verses 17 through 25. In 1 Samuel, I want to briefly touch on a passage which may present more questions than answers. In chapter 28, the Philistines were once again preparing for war with Israel. When Saul saw the size and power of the Philistine army, he was terrified. And perhaps more frightening for Saul, God was no longer answering his inquiries. And the priestly ephod, which contained the Urim, was with David, and the prophets were silent. Conversely, God has been speaking to David and providing direction to him. Therefore, in a foolish act of desperation, Saul sends his servants to seek out the medium of Endor. However, Saul himself had prohibited such practices from the land, which is why he goes to Endor at night. It should be noted that to reach Endor, Saul has to pass over the ridge where the Philistines were encamped. Yet, in verses 8 and 9, we read, "So Saul disguised himself and put on other clothes and went there, he and 2 men with him. They came to the woman by night, and he said, 'Consult a spirit for me, and bring up for me the one whom I named to you.' The spirit Saul is seeking to have an audience with is the prophet and judge Samuel. When the medium of Endor sees Samuel, she describes him as wrapped in a robe, which was enough to convince Saul, who immediately falls to the ground in subservience to the words of Samuel. Samuel repeats the judgment of God first reported in chapter 15 and tells Saul that the war with the Philistines would bring the fulfillment of God's judgment and the death of Saul and his 2 sons the next day. This story has led many to wonder whether or not Samuel really appeared to Saul. On the one hand, Saul does not actually see Samuel. Therefore, since the practices of mediums were forbidden by God's law, and God himself had refused to answer Saul by any divinely approved means, such as prophets, dreams, or visions, it is possible that this woman faked Samuel's speech by using an accomplice. After all, Samuel was a well-known figure, and since Saul was lying prostrate on the ground, he would not have seen who was actually speaking. Also, the message from chapter 15 might have been widely known. In essence, the medium of Endor creates an elaborate hoax. On the other hand, many scholars, noting that Samuel appears suddenly and seems to surprise and alarm the woman, and that the prediction of Saul's defeat and death was so confident that it suggests that Samuel really appeared. That is, this woman is completely surprised that something actually happened which she is unable to control. In this case, God, who is eminent over all, is able to take what Saul thought as a way to skirt God's commandments in silence and turn it into a way to once again proclaim to Saul that his impending defeat at the hands of the Philistines is the result of God's judgment on Saul's actions and not the power of the Philistines. As God repeatedly proves, he is sovereign over all, and there's nothing in heaven or on earth that escapes his notice or that can thwart his plans.
As we continue in the story of Ruth, she has remained in the fields of Boaz for both the barley and wheat harvest, which would have lasted around 7 weeks. The events that transpire in chapter 3 have been met with speculation over the years. However, the central intention by Ruth and Naomi is based upon loyalty to one's family. As widows, Naomi and Ruth are in a precarious position, and Boaz, as Naomi's kinsman, is in a position to provide security for both of them. In Ruth 3, verse 9, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over for your servant, for you are next of kin." By asking Boaz to spread his cloak over her, Ruth is proposing marriage. This same language is used in Ezekiel 16:8, in a parable describing God's marriage-like commitment to Israel. Also, earlier in Ruth, we find similar imagery when Boaz praises Ruth for her faithfulness to Naomi. Ruth 2:12. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. The Hebrew word in the passage that is translated wings is also used in Ruth 3:9 to describe the cloak that Ruth is asking Boaz to spread over her. By taking Ruth as his wife, Boaz is fulfilling the blessing that he speaks over Ruth in chapter 2. Ruth, who Boaz prays will find shelter under God's wing, will find fulfillment in the man who himself spreads his cloak or wing over her in marriage. However, there are some risks for Boaz here. As the kinsman redeemer, Boaz will claim the family rights to Elimelech's fields, as well as Naomi and Ruth. This also means that the family responsibilities and inheritance will be combined as well. Therefore, Boaz and his household will assume additional economic burden and risk. Also, the children of Ruth would have a claim to the share of the inheritance. We see this reluctance to assume this additional responsibility and burden by a closer relative who Boaz meets at the city gate and who also has the first right of refusal. Therefore, despite this system of redemption having been arranged in God's law to help care for families, especially widows and orphans, it seems that there were not many who assumed the role and responsibility of the family redeemer. However, Boaz demonstrates his faithfulness to God and the commandments by actively seeking to become the kinsman redeemer for Naomi and Ruth, a Moabite. After all, as his name implies, in him is strength. Boaz redeems Ruth and Naomi from a life of poverty and gives them a family. And remember, all of this happens because Ruth was faithful to Naomi when she was willing to leave her family in Moab. Ruth truly lives up to her name. She was a true, faithful friend to Naomi. At the end of the book of Ruth, we see the connection between Ruth and King David. In Ruth 4, verses 21 and 22, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. Ruth's great-grandson is King David. But the story does not end there. In the Gospel of Matthew, we find Ruth listed in the genealogy of Jesus, the King of Kings. In Matthew 1:5, and Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed, the father of Jesse. We should pause here and make one final observation. Notice that the mother of Boaz is Rahab, a foreign prostitute of Jericho, who aided the spies sent by Joshua. This means that not only did Boaz marry an outsider to Israel in Ruth, but his mother was also an outsider to Israel. Yet, Boaz grows up to become a man who honors God, not by his birthright, but by his actions. He honors God's commands as a redeemer of his family. He honors God by taking care of the most vulnerable. He honors God by allowing those in need to glean his field. The story of Ruth is also a story of redemption, a story of a woman whose friendship, loyalty, love, and compassion redeemed her mother-in-law from a life of bitterness, and the story of a man, an outsider himself, who was committed to God and faithfully trusted God. And most of all, a story which leads Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem, the town of Ruth and Boaz, to welcome the one who will redeem the entire world. Thank you for joining us today. Until next time, stay on the trail.